Hello. Okay, so quick update. Later today, I will be last minute appointments to go to. Um, so they got net cancellation, so I took it. So I'll be dealing with that, and I don't know if they're going to pull anything or not, or if it's just going to be a consultation. Record this little three-parter all in one night, and frankly, it's kind of good because this is going to take three parts because I want to talk about my first webcomic and to good, or just why it failed, basically. Pretty decent for someone starting out. Before I do that, I need you to explain what a Sprite comic is and make a better defense of it. Let's see if I can get this in the time frame. So what is a Sprite comic? Basically, it's a comic where instead of it's drawn, it's done with ripped game sprites. There are websites out there that have ripped sprites for games, mostly for decoration or to create your own animations. But there was a guy named Dave Annes. He wanted to do a comic strip called Bob and George, the comic strip. It was supposed to be two brothers, and they didn't know the other one was a superhero, one was a supervillain, and they didn't know that their brother was the other person. Also about their personal lives and their friends, and George was going to college and all this, and had roommates and all that stuff. And he got the URL and everything, and told his friends about the thing, but he had trouble starting because he really didn't like his art. In fact, he had a few flaws in that comic because of that. But he wanted to do something with the URL, so he found some sprites from Mega Man 7. They created a Mega Man parody comic. It's kind of a placeholder comic. He wasn't thinking too much of it. Then he finally started his comic, and he wasn't happy with it, so he went back to the Mega Man stuff, and he tried again, and went back to the Mega Man stuff again. And meanwhile, there aren't too many Mega Man fan comics on the internet at this time. I don't think there are too many now. And we weren't getting any of the Mega Man manga, and it was a long time before Archie or Dreamwave would be doing Mega Man comics. No, I think it was actually after Dreamwave's Mega Man. And so he kind of built up this big fan base of Mega Man fans with this parody Sprite comic. And so he just said, the heck with it, I'm going to make this comic. And he created two characters named Bob and George. He learned, did a lot of parodies of old Mega Man games. He just built this really big following. And there were other people who started doing their own Sprite comics, and myself included. And there was a few things. A lot of people were imitating the things that are going on Bob or George. For example, Dave was kind of a character in the comic, a character called the Author, which is this godlike being who controlled the comic, and everybody hated him because they wanted him to get on with the already, and they really didn't want to be doing this and all that stuff. And a lot of people didn't just imitate doing a Sprite comic. A lot of them were kind of imitating Bob and George with fan parodies and everything else. And this might have been one of the things that came back to bite me with my comic. We'll go into the comic itself tomorrow, and then Thursday we buy the comic Ultimately Bound. But one of the things that also need to be noticed, as I explained to the storyline for the Sprite comic that I created, Sprite comics were really hated by a number of people people in the regular comic community because they thought it was a cop-out. They thought, you know, you're not putting that much effort into it. And you're not, all you're just using a bunch of old game sprites and game backgrounds that somebody else made. Who cares? Believe it or not, there's a lot that goes into more goes into that. You've got to look at things like resizing. You've got to look into edit the sprites to become different characters. And that's a little different than because it's basically photo editing. And yes, you're creating new poses and turning the old poses into new characters and deciding which pose is best. You got to decide which pose for a character is needed to best express whether it's punching somebody, turning on television, or anything like that. There is creativity in making a sprite comic. It's just a very different kind of creativity, and it requires different skills. I'm not saying it's better or worse than hand-drawn comics, but as speaking as somebody who's done both, I know that there is a difference in how it's done. It's not that sprite comics are necessarily easy. Easier in some ways for people who can't draw, which my drawing at the time was not something I would have shared with anybody else. It was just not very good at all. And I kind of see Ennis's point. And the thing, this was a way for people who didn't know how to make comics but could edit video and edit the sprites and use different kind of artistic talent, and they could still be able to tell stories and have characters having different adventures. But everything, but there was just a lot of hatred in the webcomic community against sprite comics, and this is something that played into what I was going to do with my comic. And also, like I said, a lot of people were imitating David Annes with like author characters, like, "Oh, hi, I'm the guy who makes the comic. Oh, we hate you." I was going to kind of play around with that, and I'll explain more about that in tomorrow's video. One more thing I need to bring up is one of the things that got brought up time was a character called Ran, which was created by a guy whose screen name was Ran. And his thing was that he was a robot created by Kalinka. For those of you who don't know Mega Man, Kalinka Cossack is the daughter of Dr. Cossack, who's one of the villains in the Mega Man game. But in Mega Man 3 or 4, something like that. At any rate, he was forced into it because Ali had kidnapped his daughter. So somebody had to make Kalinka sprites out of Roll sprites, because Roll is the only character in 16-bit in the Mega Man games that was female. And that was kind of thing. The Mega Man sprites were popular because sprites to edit. They're easier to resize without too much visual damage if you knew how to do it. They were a lot easier base, and they're just best looking sprites in the Mega Man series for all sprites. These were the sprites that came off the Super Nintendo, and they were just the best the best sprites to work with, and really just they had a lot more definition to work with. And so that's what they use. I use the stuff from Mega Man X and did some minor tooling. I did one from another Mega Man game that was on the Genesis, and just retooled that a bit. Frankenstein sprites, bits and pieces from sprites to form new sprites. So I was creating original sprites. I was doing original, in a sense, I was doing original art. And a lot of people went beyond that too. And there are reasons why I was using certain characters, which I'll get into. there are people who've just done all sorts of things. Right now, one of my reviewer friends from the reviewing community, Sufera, Bolts, and it's a Sprite comic. I don't know if they're edited sprites or original sprites, but he did that because he's not. I guess because he's not a very good artist. I don't know. I've never really seen a whole ton of his hand-drawn art, but he just prefers to make a Sprite comic, and it's a super series, completely original, completely divorced from Mega Man. It's kind of a superhero sci-fi series. Involves politics and fantasy and 80s references, and also it's really good. Starbolts.blogspot.com. Check it out. And then he also does a review series called Comic Showcase, which is mostly about Marvel comics, but poor kid. Yeah, I'm more of a DC guy. But, he has a friend that occasionally makes him do Valiant comics. So, but I think Sprite Comics was getting way too much hate, and this was a concept that I was bringing into the comic that I was creating. And I'm kind of dancing around that now. So why don't I stop here? Tomorrow, you'll get into my Sprite comic, the storyline for the Sprite comic, and with the idea that I had and what plays into all this stuff. And then finish telling you about Ran. Ran was basically a robot that got broken a lot. He was made of very cheap Russian parts, and of course was created by this little girl. So his program would eventually be sent back to their lab. That would be immediately constructed, and then it would be teleported back out to wherever the first one hit, which sometimes came back to bite him if he. Then each of the Rans would be teleporting into a pit. It was very much a running gag, and a lot of were using it with his permission. They asked him first, like, "Hey, can we use your guy in this comic?" And this kind of plays into all this kind of plays into the storyline. The author ran a lot of the Sprite comic conventions. It all kind of plays into what I was going to do with my comic, which we will go into tomorrow. So I hope you'll tune in to see exactly what the storyline would have been had I been allowed to continue it in a comic that I called Tales from the Spriteverse. And then we'll go into why I think it failed. And some of it was my fault. Some of it was misconceptions, and I was not able to properly explain what I was doing without spoiling the comic. But I'll get more onto that in the next 2 days. Until then, if you want to see my current webcomic, which is hand-drawn, Jake and Leon, nowadays on the computer, or if you want to read any of my articles or my other commentaries on comics and other media, www.spotlight.com. If you want to see anybody else who's taking part in the Soundoff challenge, then go to Twitter and look for the hashtag #ArtSoundoff. And if you want to take part yourself and maybe you have your own things you want to say about comic creation, you can go to artsoundoff.com and find all the various prompts so you can join us. So I'll see you tomorrow for part 2 of this little retrospective into my failed comic, and I wish you happy creating.